Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a prequel of a previous lesson from John's 6th chapter in the range we covered after the range we're going to cover today. We took it from verses 22 through 46, and the 6th chapter consists of 2 days in the life of the most remarkable man who ever lived. This consists of the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, which is common. Besides the resurrection accepted, it is the only miracle whose mention is duplicated in all four Gospels. And as in Matthew and Mark's account, it is preceded by the miracle of the walking on the water. This took place at night. And then John describes the meaning of the miracle in a sermon, which is unique to him. That's the meat and substance of this chapter. But the chronological context can be established in the 5th, 6th, and 7th chapters. They are given dates. Now, in the 5th chapter, it's a festival of the Jews, and he's in Jerusalem. It doesn't say which one, but in the 6th chapter, it is near the Passover. He's still in Galilee. He may have entered into Jerusalem as an observant, practicing Jew, but there's no controversy of that year. In the first year, he clears the temple, and by the third year that he returns, he is crucified. And in the 7th chapter is the Festival of Weeks, which took place some 6 months after the miracle of the Passover miracle. So then he has 6 months life to live beginning in the 7th chapter. So a lot of it is densely concentrated, John especially, on the later years of his ministry. And we don't have too much time since we have a lot of verses to review. We just want to explain the two divisions which come before the one we're going to cover. We've done lessons on 2 of these. We haven't done verses 1 through 18. We're going to do it soon. We don't know how soon. But he heals a man on the Sabbath, and the controversy was that it was on the Sabbath. This was a big no-no, and because he claimed the power to forgive sins, the Jews were determined to kill him, not only because he had violated their Sabbath tradition. He wasn't in violation of the law of Moses. He is the master of the Sabbath, and as such, he has the prerogative to determine what is acceptable works to do on that day. But the Jews are determined to kill him. We read this again in the 7th chapter. So the murderous motivation happened sometime in one of the festivals. There were 19 biblical Jewish holidays, but there's also Hanukkah, which isn't strictly speaking biblical. That's where we find him in the 10th chapter. So we do know that wherever it was between the Passover of the first year of his ministry when he cleared out the temple and the Passover of the second year of his ministry. And then he gives a response that is everything from 19 through 47 is written and read. These are his words. This is his response to his ecclesiastical antagonist. In the range 19 through 30, it basically he gives many allusions of the resurrection to come. The power is vested in him. The Father has the power to raise the dead, but the Son will be the first fruit of the resurrection, and it's through him that we are able to even obtain that blessing. Then in the 31st verse, he gives testimony of 3 people, which was the standard observed minimum in the Jewish tribunal. We're going to learn who those are, verse 31 through 33. If I bear witness of myself, my witness is not true. There is another who bears witness of me, and I know the witness which he witnesses of me is true. You have sent to John, and he bore witness to the truth. So he's not witnessing to himself, because that is invalid in the Jewish court of law, but he has these witnesses, one of whom was John, his first cousin, who was a prophet, the likes of which Israel hadn't seen in over 400 years, and he spoke truth, and he had a reputation for truth. He was recognized as a prophet by the masses. He wasn't quite accepted or understood by the Pharisees, whom he likened to a brood of vipers in Luke's account, I believe. But I have a greater witness than that of John, for the works that the Father gave me to accomplish, the works that I do, bear witness of me, that the Father has sent me. And the Father who sent me, he bore witness of me. You have neither heard his voice at any time, nor seen his form. So the second and third witness that he refers to, respectively, are his miraculous powers. His reputation for miracles had spread to the notice and attention of one of the Sanhedrin, a man named Nicodemus, who sought him out in the night. And as I've explained in John's account, Nicodemus is mentioned only in the John Gospel, but we witness the stepping stones of faith curiosity, conviction, conversion, commitment. He's mentioned in the 7th chapter. That's when he's on the 2nd, and by the 19th chapter he goes an all-out declaration of the, but we're getting distracted, confession. But to accuse them of being estranged from him, not having heard his voice or seen his form, he's telling them that they do not know him at all, and he is him in a sense. In verse 39, you search the scriptures because you think you have everlasting life in them, and these are the ones that bear witness of me. But you do not will to come to me in order to have life. So the scriptures, there was no New Testament at the writing of this, when he certainly at the saying of this, and so the scriptures would have been the law, the writings, and the prophet, what we call the Old Testament. The Jews called the law, writings, and the prophet, so named by their genre of categories. But they do bear consistent witness. He is the fulfillment of the law of Moses. He is the and many of the Psalms have prophetic premonitions, and of course the prophets testify to him. And he's also in the history books. The trick to reading the Old Testament as a Christian is to look for him on every page. I refrain from encouraging people to find them, because I think that ultimately invites an excessive speculative exegetical approach, which doesn't serve anyone well. Verse 46, for if you believe Moses, you would have believed me, since he wrote about me. But if you do not believe his writings, how do you believe my words? So they fancied themselves disciples of Moses. I think in the 9th chapter they say that they point with pride that the blind man who he had, blind from birth man that he had restored, it had given sight to, he was blind from birth, so he didn't restore it. But they said, you are his disciple, we are disciples of Moses. But Yahshua has a different standard and different interpretation and different authority about who Moses is and what he means. If they truly read him with discernment, they would recognize him in their midst. So this is the first verse of the 6th chapter, John's Gospel lesson itself. After this, Yahshua went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, that in Lake Kinnereth, Lake Tiberias, alternately translated. So Galilee is the region to the north of north of Samaria, which is the north of Judea, where Jerusalem is. So in the 5th chapter, this is a breaking. There's no after this could mean there's no definite amount of time, definite duration of time, but he's to the north of where he once was, and the Lake Tiberias was so named by a town that it was part of the Lake of Galilee. It would have been a little enclave in the sea itself, so named for the town, which was founded in 20 A.D. This would have been relatively recent, so it wouldn't have been in much use in his day, but that's where he was. He was in an obscure location that had a barely settled town. Tiberius was not the emperor when Yahshua was born. That was Caesar Augustus. And a large crowd was following him because they saw his signs, which he did on those who were sick. So in the 4th chapter, he heals a centurion's sick servant from a distance. He just gives the word, he says it, and then he comes home and finds out that so he has these, that was the, but there's no, besides the paralytic that he restores to take up his bed and walk, thy sins have been forgiven. So there were signs, plural, so there were more than what is alluded to in John's account, and John makes plain with some hyperbole at the conclusion that if there's not enough space in the physical parameters of earth to record a book of all the good works that he did. And Yahshua went up on a mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. So it's just him and the 12, but there's this crowd that's gathering him, and he's on top of a mountain to get away from them, but not completely distant or isolated from them. He's just separated with his disciples, and they are plotting. And then the 4th verse gives us our chronological context. And the Passover was near, the festival of the Jews. So this would have been one of the 3 holidays, sacred days of the Jewish calendar, where grown Jews were commanded and expected to go to Jerusalem to gather in unison. The other 2 were the Festival of Weeks and the Pentecost, which was 50 days after the Passover. Then the Festival of Weeks was in the 7th chapter that we read, so some 6 months after. Then Yahshua, lifting up his eyes and seeing a large crowd coming towards him and said to Philip, "Where shall we buy food? Where shall we buy bread for them to eat?" So he sees the crowd coming when they're coming, and he approaches Philip, the disciple who is identified by name. He is the one who meets him in the first chapter. He gives the testimony that is received from, I think, Andrew, and he spreads it to Nathanael and overcomes his skepticism. He's also the one who asked the question, which leads to the answer of the way, the truth, and the life in the 14th chapter. Which way do we go to the Father? And but the Messiah is asking him a question here. He's saying, where can we purchase bread for them to eat? Because this crowd is hungry, they want food, and I'm going to give it to them. And he said, trying him, for he himself knew what he would do. So whenever divinity asks a question to a human, and Yahshua is fully divine, he is man yet more than man, it is never because he lacks any information. It is always and only to test the response and develop the faith of the recipient of the question. So he already knew what he was going to do. He knew that there was no hindrance or obstacle. He just wanted to test what he would do wearing his shoes. And ultimately it boils down to a matter of faith. Philip answered him, 200 pieces of silver worth of bread is not sufficient for them, for every one of them to receive a little. So this would have been a significant chunk of change, 200 pieces of silver. I think Judas sold the master for 30 pieces of silver, which was the going rate for the price of a slave. So this was a large crowd. There are some 5,000 listed, and bread, would have cost that much. One of his disciples, Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter, said to him, "Here is a boy who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are these for so many?" So Andrew is the elder brother of Peter, who had given him the call. He was a disciple of John the Baptist, along with John, the author of this, who received the call and came running. And Andrew and John and Peter formed the upper trio, the inner entourage of the 12. They were the 3 elite near the top. But he points out that here's a young boy who has, a minuscule amount of loaves and fish, certainly not sufficient to feed this many people. But if we take what we have and take it from there, leave the rest to him, he will give us the increase. That is the lesson that we have to take and profit about our resourcefulness. We surrender all to him, he will give the increase. His miracle of multiplication, if we tithe 10%, we are promised that we will have a barn insufficient to hold all the return rate of the agricultural output. That would have meant more to ancient agriculturalists than it does us moderns, but the principle is intact. And Yahshua said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, and the men, numbering about 5,000, sat down. So we have 3 numbers. There's 200 pieces of silver. That's how much it would cost to feed a crowd this substantial. They have 5 loaves and 2 fish and 5,000 mouths to feed. But he's telling them to sit down. That means that he's going to feed them. They're not going to leave without having received a meal from him or something to eat. Now this ultimately tests the motive and the sincerity of the followers, because a lot of people were there for just because they were hungry and they wanted food, and they didn't make the spiritual usefulness. The meaning of the sermon is what gives meaning to the miracle in ways that the other gospel accounts do not convey as thoroughly as John does. And Yahshua took the loaves, and having given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down, and the same with the fish, as much as they wanted. So he took the loaves, the 5 and the 2, and he gave thanks. So it is all predicated on thanks. He gives thanksgiving in advance of the increase and the abundance and the multiplication that he is able to wield through prayer. And through the prayer to the Father, to whom he gives thanks for the increase. He distributes them to the disciples, and the disciples take it among them, and they distribute it to the crowd gathered and assembled. And it's the same process with the fish, the gratitude and the thanks and the prayer, and then the multiplication, so much so that they had as much as they wanted. So it was not just a meal for everyone, it was a buffet of sorts. And when they were filled, he said to his disciples, "Gather the broken pieces that are left over, so that none gets wasted." So having just been filled out of thin air with the resourcefulness, the lesson of the positive return of the resources can be reciprocated in the negative. So don't let anything go to waste. Do not take for granted. Do not squander the excess of the abundance that we need, because if we waste it and fritter away, then we will not make the most of the miracle. So, we exist. He can feed us spiritually or physically till our heart's content, but we still have to gather what is left over to save for another day, because we are reliant on our daily bread. That's where we are to pray daily for our daily bread, the wants and provisions, not the wants, the needs and provisions of that day. We got to guard against selfishness when we pray, but that takes us to the Lord's Prayer. That's slightly outside where I want to stay focused. So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with broken pieces of the 5 barley loaves, which were left over by those who had eaten. So their leftover return rate was exceedingly greater than their starting, what they had multiplied from the scratch sum. The launching pad of their this amazing miracle was 5 loaves and 2 fish, and now they have 12 baskets with just the barley loaves. So they have more than they began with. So if we gather the resources, we'll make the most of it and not let it squander or waste away. Not make the most of it is a sin to do it when he provides us with abundance. Then the man, having seen the sign that Yahshua did, said, "This is truly the prophet who is coming to the world." Prophet is capitalized in this translation, so they have an inkling that he is the prophet, as alluded to by Moses in Deuteronomy 18. Remember, he said to his ecclesiastical antagonist in the preceding chapters, if you read the law of Moses with discernment, you would recognize that I am he who was alluded to, not only in the Exodus, the typologies in Leviticus, the atonement typologies, the Passover, the Lamb of Elohim, et al., etc., down to Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53. So they really did have him, but this would have been the specific reference of the one that Moses pointed to, who is greater than him. This is the Messiah, and the Jews are still waiting for their version of the Messiah, but this is the one who came into the world. They recognized it. The problem is they had a fatal misunderstanding of the Messiah's mortal mission and what it was all about. They wanted to make him king by force, and Yahshua knows this. Then Yahshua, knowing that they were about to come and seize him, that they might make him king, withdrew again to the mountain alone by himself. So he was never impressed by the ability to draw a crowd. Yeah, he had it in him, but the problem with the larger our churches grow is that more of the world and more sinners creep in. So a lot of these men had impure motives and impure intentions to make him the Messiah in their own image, the type of Messiah they wanted. They thought anyone who could multiply breads could cause thunder to the sky to wipe out the Romans, and of course he could, but that wasn't the Father's will. He came to offer us a way out. He's our Savior from sin, and not Israel's Savior from foreign occupation. So we find him once more in the mountains, and this time not even the disciples are alone, and they're somewhere else, which leads to the night scene of the same day. So the 6th chapter is 2 days in the life. He returns to the same location, meets the same crowd, and then he kind of winnows because eventually, they say, this is a hard saying, who can hear it? Does this offend you? In 59 and verse 60. So the sermon of the I am the bread of life sermon. This is the first of the 7 I am claims, which collectively paint a portrait of the divinity of the Savior. Bread of life, we read that 6:35-48. Light of the world, 8:12, 9:5. Gate to the sheep, John 10:7. Good shepherd, 10:11-14. Resurrection and life, 11:25. And way, truth, and life, that's 1, that's 6. And then the divine vine in 15, that's 7. So these are what he is, and that is a divine claim. He also says elsewhere in the 8th chapter, before Abraham was, I am. That's a claim to eternality. But we're going to read what happens. And when the evening came, his disciples went down to the sea. So when the night cast its shadow and the sun was down and it was the PM, his disciples went out to the sea. They are fishermen by vocation. But the thing about the Sea of Galilee is that it is prone to sudden winds because of its geography of the mountain location and how it affects the Mediterranean can go over, and it can cause disturbing storms on a whim, and that is what they enter into. And entering into the boat, they were going over the sea toward Capernaum, and they had already become dark, and Yahshua had not yet come to them. So they're making their way to Capernaum, which is the center of his ministerial operations, at least in the synoptics. John gives us more details that are otherwise absent from his ministry in Judea that they, for whatever reason, don't record. But Capernaum was one of the main cities, certainly on the Sea of Galilee, if not the main city. He performed many miracles in it, yet he cast a judgment of woe upon it for rejecting him. And it's dark, and Yahshua is not with them. And the sea was rising because a great wind was blowing. So we don't know if we did the best presentation of how the Sea of Galilee is subjected to sudden violent storms in the sea, but that is what happened in any case, and these are experienced fishermen. When they had rowed about 25 or 30 stadios, they saw Yahshua walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were afraid. So the measurement in English is about 3.5 miles. That's what the 25 or 30 stadios is. Sea of Galilee is a lot wider than that, but they're already near the shore, and it's a terrible storm, and they might have to turn back, but they notice that Yahshua is walking on the water and coming near the boat, and they are afraid because they think it's a ghost in other counts, but he assures them with the answer that it is I, do not be afraid. 20th verse, and he said to them, it is I, do not be afraid. So in the storms of life, they're a source of fear, anxiety, trouble, and dilemma, but some of the storms are sent not because we disobeyed, although that was certainly the case with Jonah in a very literal sense, but the storms in the metaphorical sense are the challenges and dilemmas and the anxiety racking things that enter into our life, these influences and everything else. So they are afraid, and where fear is, faith cannot reside. No more than man can serve two masters, can faith and fear simultaneously dwell in the same vessel in equal proportion, or even at all. They determined, therefore, to take him into the boat, and once the boat was at the land where they were going. So he gets in, and the sea, as long as he's in there, the sea, maybe he didn't calm the storm in this situation, but he was certainly able to bring them to their intended destination, which is on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and they return the other side the next day and address much of the same crowd, the ones who had benefited the miracles. And what happens after John 6, we've already covered the sermon parts in 2 sessions, the latter of which is verses 47 through 71, is a scene some 6 months later at the Festival of Weeks. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.